All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining this evening. My name is Chris Rice with WXY Studio. Thank you for joining our public workshop number 5 for the Vision for Brooklyn Marine Terminal. We're excited for this meeting and for the discussion ahead. Go ahead to the next slide. Before we get started, just some Zoom reminders and housekeeping. The chat will be open during the meeting. The chat is really for comments or to inform us of technical challenges. So please use the chat function for that. Later on in the meeting, when we get to the Q&A portion, we're going to be utilizing the raise hand function. So if you have a question at that point, you'll click the raise hand to join the queue. Our host will unmute you when it's your turn to speak. We also have interpretation available tonight, both for Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese. The channel labeled Chinese is Mandarin, and the channel labeled Korean is Cantonese. And you click the globe that says interpretation to access that. We also have closed captioning available by clicking CC at the center of the screen. And then specifically, if you want to ask a question, we're asking folks to use the Q&A feature to ask a question. You can submit that both during the presentation and when we get to the Q&A portion specifically. And just want to be clear that if you have a question, you do want to use the Q&A feature. We're not responding to questions that are asked in the chat. So just want to be clear about that. I also want to acknowledge the task force leadership. I think we're joined by Congressman Dan Goldman, State Senator Andrew Gennardes, and also staff members from Councilmember Alexa Aviles' office. So thank you. Next slide. Tonight's meeting will largely be Q&A, but we'll kick off with a presentation focused on the preferred site plan, resiliency, and transportation. And we'll hear from Jennifer Sun from EDC, Pippa Bashir from Scape Landscape Architecture, and Seth Ullman from EDC. After that presentation, we'll move into Q&A for an hour and 20 minutes, and then we'll close at the end of the meeting with next steps. And the real goal of today's meeting is to really review and discuss the preferred site plan and sort of take a deeper dive into how transportation, the potential transportation and resiliency benefits that the vision for BMT can bring to the community. And really want to provide a lot of space and time to answer questions specifically on resiliency, transportation, and the planning process. And with that, I will kick it over to Jennifer Sun from EDC.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everyone. It's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jennifer Sun. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Planning Division at NYC EDC. So I'll kick off our presentation by really highlighting the unique opportunity that we have with the Brooklyn Marine Terminal to create both a modern all-electric maritime port and really make sure that we're investing in its future to be higher capacity while also more environmentally sustainable, and also seize the opportunity to create a mixed income and mixed use community on the Brooklyn waterfront. Next slide. So we have a range of project goals that are aspirational, recognizing that we, again, have a unique opportunity now that EDC has management control of this site from the Port Authority. And with a 122-acre site, we'd have the opportunity to be both bold and comprehensive in how we think about addressing these important project goals in a holistic way. First and foremost, it's really investing in a port, specifically a container terminal, as well as a flex terminal at BMT, recognizing how important our supply chains are for continuing to provide a mode of transportation by water for bringing goods in for both businesses and consumers in New York City. And we want to do that in a way that's environmentally sustainable by electrifying the port, while really catalyzing a citywide Blue Highway network for moving goods differently throughout the city by water to reduce the impact of trucks in our neighborhoods. There's also an opportunity to increase the amount of open space, both for existing and new residents at BMT, and to create the conditions to support housing and other neighborhood amenities by really planning comprehensively for climate change, sea level rise, tidal flooding, and extreme storm surge events in the future, as well as really investing in transit infrastructure and prioritizing pedestrians and how we think about designing streets with the overall goal of reducing auto dependency in this neighborhood. Another important goal is really doing our part by increasing the amount of housing at BMT and providing housing at all income levels, but also supporting affordable home ownership as well as off-site preservation. So trying to be as comprehensive as we can in delivering affordability at BMT. And finally, overall, of thinking about how we can, again, with the scale of this site, develop a mixed-use program that is financially self-sustaining. So it's generating cross-subsidy from a variety of revenue-generating uses to complement city capital investment to realize a project that is financially self-sustainable over the long term. Next slide. So just as a reminder of where we started and how we have evolved since we kicked off our planning process last year, in order to achieve the project goals that I described, we tested a number of scenarios back in the fall and at the beginning of this year. The most significant changes that we tested was the question of whether there would be potential benefits of moving the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal from its current location to a location closer to Brooklyn Bridge Park. That was scenario 3. We also looked at significantly more housing density to really push the envelope in thinking about how much housing could be supported on this site. But in realizing that the trade-off was that it would severely reduce the amount of area for a container terminal, we have ultimately decided to move forward with scenario 1, which we believe is a balanced plan for both supporting the vision of a higher performing and more efficient modern all-electric port, with also realizing the benefits of a mixed-use development at BMT. And the scenario 1 also includes the possibility of partnering with UPS and including their site into the overall site plan as a way of realizing some additional community benefits like open space, resiliency, and housing. Next slide. So where we are today is this proposed preferred site plan that incorporates a lot of feedback from the task force, advisory group members, and the community. What we've heard from our community engagement over and over again is the importance of really creating more opportunities for existing residents, in particular, public waterfront access, open space, affordable light industrial space, creating a waterfront destination in Atlantic Basin, and also creating both a combination of destination parks, meaning larger parks that can support a range of active and passive uses on the southern end on the UPS site, which we call BMT South, and on the north end of the site, what we call BMT North, which is an extension of the Columbia Waterfront District. So on those two bookends, we have the opportunity to create destination parks of over 5 acres in size. But in between, we also heard the importance from task force members of really looking at opportunities for creating neighborhood parks as well. And so what we've also proposed in BMT North, adjacent to Columbia Waterfront District, is the potential creation of a 2-acre park at the corner of DeGraw and Columbia Street. And then in Atlantic Basin, really focusing on creating continuous public waterfront access and new open space next to the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal that really transforms BCT as a community amenity with year-round programming and events that can increase the amount of activity that supports Red Hook businesses. Throughout this site, we have also focused on integrating a comprehensive resiliency system that we will go into more detail about in subsequent slides, as well as a site circulation plan to really improve how traffic moves around the neighborhood, reduce the impact of trucks on the existing neighborhood, and importantly, really increase transit access for existing residents as well as future residents. improve bus service, and really use all the levers we have to reduce car use in this new neighborhood. Next slide. So a couple of highlights in terms of what has changed since the last public workshop in March. So notably, in response to community feedback, we've looked at opportunities for reducing the overall housing density from almost 9,000 units to our current proposal of 7,700 units, distributed amongst BMT North, Atlantic Basin, and BMT South. While we've reduced the overall housing count, we've increased the total number of permanently affordable units to almost 3,000 units across the site. They'll be permanently affordable at a 60% AMI. We have also increased the amount of open space, as I mentioned, by creating destination open spaces at Pier 7 and at BMT South, as well as creating a larger neighborhood park at BMT North. We've created more waterfront access, especially in Atlantic Basin. We've also increased the amount of light industrial space by integrating a standalone 50,000 square foot light industrial building at BMT South, as well as creating a 170,000 square foot standalone industrial building in Atlantic Basin that can provide opportunities for small and mid-sized industrial firms to start up and grow at BMT. Other types of spaces that we've created is community facility space integrated into BMT North and the Atlantic Basin, including a school in BMT North adjacent to the Columbia Waterfront District that would be envisioned as a real important community anchor. And then also integrating a workforce and experiential learning center in response to community feedback, especially from Red Hook residents, for creating opportunities to expose young people and adults to the maritime industry and career opportunities earlier and more comprehensively. And finally, we've increased the amount of commercial and retail space to really support neighborhood retail and businesses at BMT North and Atlantic Basin. Next slide. We've also worked closely with the task force leadership, the task force and advisory group members in defining financial investments and programmatic investments that need to be made in order to ensure that the infrastructure and the spaces that we're creating benefit from additional investment to really ultimately deliver positive impacts for businesses and residents. And so with that in mind, again, we've made a commitment to increase the overall affordability to 35% from 25%. And of the permanently affordable units that would be created at BMT, 200 of them would be reserved for NYCHA residents in order to provide more stable and permanently affordable housing for NYCHA, but also to create the opportunity to address capital improvements at Red Hook houses. We're also committing to creating a $50 million fund for supporting affordable homeownership, both on-site, providing down payment assistance for homeownership, as well as off-site affordable housing preservation. Some other highlights, and I won't go through all of them, is just also notably, we're also committing to a $25 million pilot for a new electric shuttle to really demonstrate the potential demand and need for improving transit access to BMT South, Red Hook houses, and BMT North. So it's really an opportunity to be a proof of concept for our MTA collaboration. We're also committing $30 million towards a new destination cultural space in BMT South, the creation of a $10 million industrial developer fund that would also provide discounted industrial rents to really provide affordable industrial space that owners can also use to make their spaces more climate resilient. And finally, a $30 million commitment towards workforce training and building out that experiential learning center. And so with that, I'm going to pass the presentation to Pippa to kick off our presentation of our resiliency plan for BMT.
Thank you, Jen. I'm really excited to be here and get to discuss the resilience component of this project, because resilience has really been a strong and core component of the project throughout, as the BMT plan really provides an unprecedented opportunity to use best practice in resilience planning and design to design and build from the outset with climate change in mind, ensuring that all new development, whether we're talking about port or industrial or housing or the infrastructure, is designed with future flooding and temperatures in mind. But this is also about increasing the resilience and decreasing risk, particularly from flooding to surrounding neighborhoods and the nearly 60,000 New Yorkers who live there today. The BMT project is an investment in the resilient future for Red Hook and Columbia waterfront. Next slide. And there's some core components to this approach that I'm going to dig in a little more deeply today. The redevelopment will include a multi-layered flood defense system that reduces risk to the site and surrounding neighborhoods. The project is committed to managing stormwater on site using best practices so that the project relieves rather than strains the existing drainage system, and that streets and open space will be designed to contribute to this stormwater management, but also to help mitigate urban heat and the heat island effect. Next slide. There was a great deal of input and feedback over the course of this project from other public meetings like this, from workshops, from the advisory committees and task force around risk and resilience. Many of the frequent questions had to do with the level of flood protection and the drainage and stormwater management approach is just the overall resilience strategy. And common priorities and recommendations really centered around providing protection from future coastal storms, avoiding putting new development, particularly housing, at risk, and the project's commitment to setting a standard for resilient planning, as well as prioritizing green infrastructure where it can be effective. Next slide. Of the risk topics and hazards, as it will come to no surprise to those of us who live and work here, is that coastal flooding and flood risk were the most prevalent concerns, and understandably so, as the BMT site, along with much of the surrounding neighborhood, is very low and prone to flooding from coastal storms, but also increasingly high tides from sea level rise, as well as stormwater. One of the important things to understand is that the BMT site and the neighborhoods are exposed to coastal flooding from multiple directions. And this includes storm surge and wave action from the west, from the harbor, but also flooding that comes from the south and east across Red Hook from Erie Basin. And all planning here then needs to take into account sea level rise, which according to the NPCC, which is the New York City Panel on Climate Change, could be up to 2 feet by 2050 and as much as 6 feet by 2100, which is the type of time horizon we're looking at. Next slide. And over the years, there have been a number of plans for comprehensive coastal flood defense and adaptation for Red Hook, and each has included slightly different alignments and designs, but really they all have started to converge around some form of perimeter flood defense around the Red Hook Peninsula. By integrating coastal flood defense into the plan, BMT will deliver the first section of a peninsula-wide flood defense system that has been envisioned in many plans that have preceded and informed this effort. The coastal flood defense, if you look at the middle map here, which shows in pink the proposed Army Corps HATS alignment, the coastal flood defense alignment proposed as part of this project is shown in the blue, and it delivers nearly a third of the protection envisioned in HATS, as well as adding defense for the Columbia waterfront, which is not addressed in the HATS plan. It also proposes design elevations that are based on the 2100 1% coastal flood defense versus lower elevations incorporated in other planning. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about this comprehensive multi-layered flood defense approach, which really combines adaptation and defense that is tailored to address the flood risk for the different and multiple land uses that we'll see on site. Maritime areas also need to consider flooding and adaptation, but they also need to function with direct water access. So they will be designed to ensure that they're not inundated by high tides and frequent storm events. But as direct water access is key to their operation and day-to-day functions, yard areas are going to be floodable, but able to recover quickly post-storm with power systems and other critical infrastructure that are susceptible to flooding, elevated or otherwise protected. Mixed-use developments with non-water dependent industrial, commercial, or residential mixed-use buildings will have first-floor elevations that account for flooding with sea level rise and meet current building codes. Additionally, sites and adjacent streets will be elevated as much as space, accessibility, and adjacent neighborhood experience allow to ensure that buildings are not disconnected from the street and neighborhood, and that all new development is built with a good urban fabric in mind. And finally, a neighborhood flood defense system that I alluded to before will be integrated into the new development between the port and upland uses, and largely integrated into open space, including new neighborhood parks and the expanded Greenway corridor, versus being just a wall. Next slide. So discuss those elements, but here you can see this multi-layered approach shown more in plan. And it really is critical to addressing flood risk while maintaining water access to the site. In this plan diagram, you can see resilient but floodable port area shown in blue, as well as resilient but floodable water-oriented destination parks. These will be designed to be resilient, but need to be floodable because of their direct access and need to connect to the water that is so essential to their function. The neighborhood flood defense system is represented by the dark orange line. It will be a flood wall, but largely buried or integrated into new site features like the parks and the Greenway. In addition to this flood defense system, new streets and development sites inland of the flood defense system will be elevated to mitigate that grade change from the surrounding streets to provide access to the port and some passive flood protection to the surrounding neighborhood during more frequent and less severe storm events, meaning that any gates incorporated would have to close less often. Now, there have been a lot of questions about how this new resilience component, particularly coastal flood defense, relates to the current Red Hook Coastal Resilience Project. And I want to point out the Red Hook Coastal Resilience Project shown in purple here. This project will proceed as planned. It is a much needed near-term coastal flood risk reduction measure for Red Hook. And the BMT project will not slow down its implementation. The way to think of what we're talking about here for BMT is as the next phase, the next step, building on and increasing the level of risk reduction that's provided by Red Hook Coastal Flood Resilience. And so in a moment, in the next series of maps, I'm going to illustrate some of the estimated flood exposure depths with and without the project. And Red Hook Coastal Resilience Project is designed to provide flood defense to the inland neighborhood in a 10% annual chance storm through 2050. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that that same storm by 2100, we can look at the next slide, would be overtopped. Can you advance to the next slide? Yeah. So we'll see that, and then in the 100-year, we can jump to the next one. But eventually in the 100-year storm by 2100, these defense systems would still result in flooding of the site because of that inundation, not via the BMT site, but from across Red Hook. Although you will see that the elevated areas of BMT would flood at a lower depth. But this is why it is so critical to invest in the long term. And you can jump to the next slide. And this residual risk is why the BMT segment needs to be seen as the first step towards an integrated, comprehensive, peninsula-wide flood defense system for Red Hook and the Columbia waterfront. EDC is committed, as we said, to building this first segment, but also to studying this expanded system and pathways to implementation for it. Because with this larger site system in place, designed to the same design flood elevation as proposed on BMT, this could provide flood defense against that 100-year storm through 2100 as shown here. So what is proposed as part of BMT gets us a third of the way there. And unlike, just the plans on paper, this segment will be funded and built as part of the project. So next slide. But we know that this is not just about coastal flood defense. Managing stormwater and inland flooding needs to and will be part of the BMT plan. So this plan will leverage the proposed open space to manage stormwater and integrated best practices in green, gray, and hybrid strategies for detention, retention, and conveyance into all development, avoiding and mitigating impacts to the existing drainage system and neighborhood. This is why the city is undergoing a DEP-led drainage plan for the BMT site and adjacent neighborhoods to identify the infrastructure needs and best strategies for managing stormwater and addressing inland flooding for Red Hook, Columbia waterfront, and the BMT site holistically. Well, it's important, and you can go to the next slide. Well, it's important to keep in mind that we're still in the preliminary planning phase, and that much of these, there will be many more opportunities to shape design. We did want to share some visualizations, building on renderings that we've shared at prior meetings that illustrate how these flood protection and risk reduction measures can be integrated into the site. So this view is of the new roadway and greenway corridor between BMT North and the port. It shows how flood defense can be integrated into the new greenway corridor, which at a width of 60 feet is more like a linear park, but really about how we integrate that flood defense. Next slide. The existing interface between Atlantic Basin and Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, shown here, really creates almost a barrier today. Next slide. And the plan is really an opportunity not only to open and connect this gateway, but to integrate flood walls into the landscape and buildings while creating this exciting new gateway to the cruise terminal and Atlantic Basin. And this will accommodate for new and existing maritime-oriented uses and tenants alongside redevelopment and reinvigoration of the cruise terminal. And you can barely see the flood walls in this rendering. And then next slide. Understanding that a system like this would need the strategic integration of deployable gates to ensure that we have that day-to-day access to the operational port and cruise terminal facilities, but that they can really be integrated into the system. Finally, the integration of the UPS site as part of the BMT vision. That's the site we see in front of us here. Next slide. And the inclusion of this site allows the creation of new open space for Red Hook, but also the integration and extension of that flood defense system all the way to Valentino Park and connect to the high points that you have at Coffee Street. So it's, it really allows the integration of resilience throughout. And I hope that this provides, the desired clarity on the resilience approach and some of the really unprecedented opportunities for climate change adaptation that BMT provides for Red Hook and Columbia waterfront. And I'll turn it over to Seth to talk about transportation.
Thank you, Pippa. And thank you everyone for joining. Again, I'm Seth from EDC, here to talk about transportation today. It's been a focus throughout this project for obvious reasons. This neighborhood has a lot of challenges with transportation. And we think that this project is an opportunity to improve transportation, both for existing and for new residents, visitors, workers. And we want to do this first and foremost by improving mass transit and improving the way people use mass transit and bike and walk to get to the subway and the rest of the city from Red Hook and the Columbia Waterfront District. So you'll see transit pretty much first throughout this deck. We'll talk a lot about it and really excited to get into more detail in the Q&A. Throughout this process, the neighborhood and the task force has been pushing us to think bigger, think harder, and do more when it comes to this issue. And a great example of where that feedback has been incorporated, and we're really thankful for all the feedback, is around pedestrian first districts and streets. We're building a site that tries to do things that let the pedestrian really be first on every street that we're building, with autos there as a necessity, but really back of mind. And we want to design the site and the surrounding streets where it makes sense to minimize the effects of vehicles, especially trucks, which we hear again and again on the existing community. And we have a lot of different strategies to get there. One of them is to limit the amount of parking on the site so that there's limited auto ownership from new residents and limited auto use from workers. And we have a whole medley of interventions that we'd like to make around freight to reduce the impact, particularly of the heaviest trucks in the neighborhood and from the site. Next slide. And so, just like Pippa said, we've been out over the last many, many months, and every time we hear transit, please make it better. We hear trucks, please make them fewer or get them off of our streets. Please don't add more. And so that's what our plan does. We go to the next slide. We know that Red Hook is pretty close to the center of the city, but it's not well connected to the subway and the trains that are really the circulation system to get to the rest of the city. The neighborhood and the site are between about 1/2 mile and 1.5 miles. And the ways to get that last 1/2 to 1.5 miles, ways to get to the subway, are problematic. The bus doesn't work as well as it should, and the walking connections have some real challenges that we'll talk about. But because we're building this out as a mixed-use community, building out the full site through this larger vision plan, we have an opportunity to address a lot of these issues in one effort. So next slide. But I want to just briefly talk about what this project isn't. So I think I already saw in the chat a question about the BQE. There is an entire other large planning effort run by DOT that goes back many years and will be continuing later this year to talk about this project of real regional significance. And we know the BQE has an effect on this neighborhood, particularly on the Columbia waterfront. And the way it was designed cuts this neighborhood off. And so there are some ways where we can address the connectivity issues that the BQE has created. But the BMT vision plan and process is fundamentally about a different scale, on a more local scale. And while we're coordinating with DOT on the two EISs and data and making sure that we're not operating in a vacuum, we can do a different set of things through the BMT process. All the things that Jen mentioned up top, and then I'm going to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes building out a little bit more. But our values, our goals are around transit, pedestrian, cycling, a better and improved greenway, activating a blue highway in a really substantial way, and mitigating or minimizing the effects of trucks and traffic on existing streets. Next slide. So mentioned the BQE as an urban design challenge. And one of the things that it did when it entered the neighborhood is it created just one north-south passage through Red Hook and Columbia waterfront via Van Brunt and Columbia, respectively, where pretty much all the north-south traffic has to go. And that's one of the reasons there is so much congestion. And that these streets are somewhat unreliable, particularly for the B61 for the bus. And that's gotten more frustrating in recent years with the introduction of new last mile distribution facilities in the neighborhood. And these trucks and this traffic keep the bus from being able to move quickly and reliably. So next slide. We know the B61 is not as fast as it should be. And it can be really unreliable, especially during the day. We know the ferry, while as an EDC employee, we love the ferry, and we know a lot of New Yorkers do too. In Red Hook, at Pier 6, and in Atlantic Basin, it's relatively infrequent and not as well used as a lot of other stops. And so we know it can do more, and we know that while we've made some aesthetic improvements to the Atlantic Basin stop, landing in recent years, it's not the most pleasant experience. And so we think that's another thing this project can deliver. And then finally, the greenway is not contiguous. It is not to the best design standards, I'd say, throughout the entire area. and is increasingly competitive to use the space in a safe and comfortable way with traditional cyclists, joggers, walkers, and now cargo bikes from the Amazon facility, e-bikes introduced throughout the city. And so we think we can address some of these things through the project. Next slide. And that's what we aim to do. We aim to improve the buses and the ferries, to introduce shuttles, to make biking and walking safer, more pleasant, more enjoyable, and to change the way that freight moves through around the neighborhood and the port, and reduce the negative effects that it has on the existing community. Next slide. And so we have a lot of tools to do that. I'm not going to go through all of these here, but I'm going to go through a few of these in the subsequent slides. But all of these are items that are integrated or we're trying to integrate into this plan moving forward. Next slide. I want to spend a minute on transit because we get the most questions about transit, and we've done a lot of work and think that this is one of the things that this site can really unlock for the neighborhood in a transformative way. So in chatting with the community, with the MTA, with DOT, everyone agrees that the B61 can be better. It's the trunk line for the areas around the BMT site on the western portion of the neighborhoods today. And with additional demand comes additional frequency. This is how the MTA operates. When there are more riders, whenever possible, they make the bus run more frequently. And by our calculation, it's very plausible that you would double the frequency from the 10 to 12 minutes right now that you see on the B61 to like 5 or 6 minutes. And so that's part of the battle, but there's also a speed and reliability problem with the B61. And one of the things this site does, and I'll talk about it more in subsequent slides, is it opens the opportunity to create a second north-south street through the site by extending Conover and Van Brunt, which enables us to make real bus priority with local access streets on Columbia and Van Brunt, so the B61 can move, arrive more reliably. And we've talked with DOT and the MTA about interventions that we can make across the full B61 route from Windsor Terrace Park Slope all the way into downtown Brooklyn to improve connections and to make it faster and more reliable. If all of the additional transit demand from a mixed-use BMT were to land on the B61, you'd probably be looking at a limited stop service as well. It would take it from like the 60-something most used route to a top 20 or 30 route in the city, and you'd start seeing those sorts of interventions that you see elsewhere. However, we don't think that we need to put all the additional riders on that bus, and we think there's a lot of opportunities for additional buses that serve the site and the surrounding neighborhoods. So in the MTA's Brooklyn bus redesign program, our plan that they've already been out to the community on, and I think are updating later this year or next, they've proposed a new route, the B81, that would serve Atlantic Basin to Smith and Ninth and the southern area in Red Hook. Already showing before there was the notion of additional demand on the site, there was the idea that additional buses make sense here. And if not the B81, the B57, or in their redesign 27 could also extend to the southern area of this of Red Hook. Similarly at B63 terminates right at the northern area. But it's not just about getting more buses to the site, it's also about creating new destinations. So in discussions again with DOT, MTA, and the community, we've heard loud and clear this desire to get to Carroll Street, right? Right now the buses go to downtown Brooklyn and Smith and Ninth for the most part. But getting in this kind of more direct and in some ways less challenging route to Carroll Street, like the B71 used to a decade and a half ago, we think is a huge opportunity. And similarly, we've heard from the community again and again and again, we should have a bus through the Hamilton, through the Hugh L. Carey Tunnel to Financial District in Manhattan, and we agree and have been and will continue to push the MTA. However, like I said, the MTA tends to plan their service in a reactive manner. And so, again, based on feedback from the community and from the task force, we've introduced the idea of shuttles here, not to create a separate form of transit in perpetuity, but as a bridge to catalyze these potential new routes if we haven't gotten traction by the time the site is opening up, and to ensure that there are transit options beyond those already in existence as parts of the site comes online and new demand opens up, so that from day one, there's options that people are not driving. Additionally, on the ferry end of things, we have these 2 stops. We know there is an opportunity to have more frequent service, to look at other connections, and are having active conversations with the NYC Ferry team about getting beyond Wall Street and South Brooklyn and making connections to places like East 34th Street or North Brooklyn. Next slide. And then while the site itself can and will deliver a really expansive greenway, and we'll look at a sketch later in the presentation, and we can build streets that are pedestrian oriented, that leave autos really in the background and for local access only, we still need to get to the subway, and not everyone is going to take the bus. Today, a lot of folks in the neighborhood walk or they bike, and we know that the BQE forms a barrier. It is challenging to cross over in the Columbia waterfront and under in Red Hook, where connections are not always pleasant. They don't always feel safe. And DOT has already identified a range of improvements through their BQE vision plan for how to improve these crossings. And we want to use this process to work with DOT with your feedback on where the priorities should be to push forward some of these improvements in the coming years, along with improving the east-west and also north-south bike network beyond just the Greenway. Next slide. I briefly alluded to parking at the front end. Part of being a transit and walking first district means limiting the amount of parking that's on site. This is not a place where it's going to be easy or convenient for most households to own cars. And if they do, we want the parking to be provided on a district basis. So we're not talking about off-street parking in every building, garage sort of way, but maybe just a few across the site. So if people really need a car for the weekend trip to Costco, or there's a handy person coming to fix something, parking will exist, but it's not going to be convenient for day-to-day use for most people on the site. And it can't just be about improving the bus and making it hard to own a car. We want to implement transportation demand management measures, which are common on the West Coast in Europe, a little bit less common in New York City, but basically through developer fees or through like household or condo assessments, essentially having people pay for transit or city bike up front so that there's, they've basically already paid for it and they might as well use it. Next slide. On freight, Jen spoke about a modern electric port where anything and everything that can be electrified will be electrified. But there's more to that port. We want to minimize how the port's trucks act on local streets. Today, there's an entrance on Union and an exit on Hamilton that basically force all trucks going in and out of the port onto local streets. We want to move those to Hamilton and Bound to channel those trucks and other vehicles going to and from the port to the Hamilton corridor and to the entrance to the BQE there instead of at Atlantic. And we think there's a variety of tools to move other vehicles through the neighborhood to better utilize that BQE entrance. And anywhere and everywhere we can, we want to leverage not just Blue Highways, but district freight strategies, freight consolidation to move freight from larger vehicles to smaller vehicles and fewer vehicles, including down to as small as cargo bikes. Next slide. So in sum, this pulls a few of the things together. There will be a better greenway. There will be streets that are mostly about the pedestrian experience and public space, but have limited auto access on sort of the in-between east-west streets that you see here, largely in pink. We want to create a real bus priority in a way that doesn't meaningfully exist today, and push as much area traffic onto Hamilton and that interchange away from the Atlantic interchange so there aren't as many vehicles traversing the whole neighborhood. We want to pull a lot of the vehicles that are on Van Brunnen Columbia West toward the site and away from those retail corridors. We want to leverage the mixed use status of the site to have a lot more trips happen on site. And so let me show you a little bit of what that looks like, and then we'll move on to Q&A. Next slide. So Pippa already showed this slide from a resilience perspective, but this is meant to hone in on what the new North-South Street even would look like. So it's still a pedestrian first street, although maybe not a primarily or only pedestrian street like some of the interstitial ones. But you see, she talked about that pedestrian path and greenway almost being a linear park. This is the sort of width and treatment that we envision: wider sidewalks, a wider greenway, real trees, a view of the port and the skyline, and potentially a separation of electric and cargo bike micromobility to create a safer, more pleasant greenway for all users. Next slide. Meanwhile, on the street that we're thinking about, that we're talking about, this Van Brunt North, name TBD, welcome suggestions. It's just really 2 lanes, one in each direction, the same as any other street in the city, with crosswalks and stoplights or stop signs every block or so. The idea is to create this second connection, but not to create anything that's necessarily faster or more convenient for autos than anything that exists today. Next slide. And then once you have that other street, this is what this can enable on Columbia. So here's Columbia and DeGraw looking north. Next slide. With the additional space on the site, we can have real priority for the B61 and any other buses on this site while maintaining local access for businesses and residents on the street, and preventing sort of cut through all the way up to Atlantic. And then next slide. This is one of the parks or one version of one of the parks that Jen mentioned earlier, actually getting wider sidewalks, trees on the street, and by having a mixed-use neighborhood, you also can address some of the transportation effects of the site. So this is one of the locations, the kind of wood facade building that you see on this kind of Plaza Park, where we've talked about having a school. And so if we have school, if we have retail, if we have jobs on site, that limits the need for existing and new residents to leave the neighborhood and to utilize transportation for their day-to-day needs. Next slide. Here is another view of that Atlantic Basin, just with the transportation points, a more pleasant experience for the ferry, more destinations for the ferry. Again, this street would be an extension of Conover, we'll call it Conover North, or whatever really everyone likes. And you see a continuation of the Greenway. Next slide. And then here on the very southern end of the site, end of the neighborhood, is Ferris Street, where today it's basically not walkable. Like if you look real close, there's a person walking in the street in the distance in this image, with the UPS site on the left and Atlantic Basin and the port in the distance. Next slide. And so we want this to look like those other streets where there is still industry, but now there's also people, and there's buses, and there's a greenway, and there's greenery. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Jen to close us out, and then we'll move to Q&A.
Thanks, Seth. So just to quickly recap, I know we're all eager to open up for Q&A. We're excited to bring this preferred plan forward in order to realize significant economic development and community benefits for both the local neighborhood and the city overall. Again, we believe that by investing in infrastructure that increases the resiliency of the neighborhood, increases transit access, and mobility as well, we have the opportunity to both support a modern electric port, but also create the opportunity for more mixed use and mixed income communities to really thrive here at BMT. We project that there will be an almost $21 billion economic impact, over 30,000 construction jobs, and over 2,000 permanent jobs, including preserving the existing 170 jobs at the container terminal. And in addition to that, it's about creating more public open space, waterfront access, and mixed uses that really support a thriving, healthy neighborhood. And with that, we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Jen. Yeah, just a few guidelines before we open it up to Q&A. So we'll have a few members of the project team come on to answer questions from the audience. That includes Jennifer Sun, Seth Ullman from EDC, Alexis Taylor, David Lowen, Matt Stout from One Architecture, and Pippa Brashear from Scape Landscape Architecture. To participate in the Q&A, we're going to ask folks to raise their hands virtually, and the host will mute you when it's unmute you when it's your turn. And just a few guidelines. We're asking folks to be respectful of all the participants, both the presenters and other attendees. We're asking folks to ask clear and concise questions. So keep your questions brief and to the point so we can get through as many questions as possible. And time is limited, so we want to be mindful that we have a limited time frame. So we're asking folks to try to keep their questions or comments to around 2 minutes, so that, again, we can get through as many participants as possible. I know folks have submitted a number of questions to the Q&A function. You're also welcome to raise your hand and ask your question as well. To get started, we'll go to James. Did we lose James? We can come back to James. Deborah.
Hello. Okay, no, it wouldn't let me unmute myself. Yeah, now it is. Okay.
Okay.
I have asked in various ways over the many public meetings and have never gotten a clear answer. What is the logical reason why a port, which is a regional transportation infrastructure, has to be paid for by revenues generated on the port when no other regional transportation infrastructure that has been built has to do so? When I drive to Queens to visit my family, I take the Kosciuszko Bridge, for which there's no revenue generated for the use. The 11 billion that went into the Long Island Railroad going to Grand Central, not getting paid for by use. The $4.5 billion that went for the Second Avenue subway, not being paid for by revenue What is the actual logic that says that this regional transportation infrastructure, and the port unquestionably is a regional transportation infrastructure, has to pay for itself when no other form has to do so? And the second quick question is, where do we think the cars are going to go when they leave Congress to go onto Columbia Street in the rendering that we just saw? It strikes me that we are a population on the Columbia Street waterfront of about 4,500 people. And we're talking about more than doubling that in a context in which we have no idea what the future of the BQE is. And if people here think that the issue is solely truck traffic, they're mistaken. I live here. I walk my dog. I know who's on Columbia Street all day long. It is private cars. This is going to be especially true given the BQE's lane, whatever that is going to happen and however long it's going to take. We had one lane closed on the BQE a couple weekends ago, and you had people driving on the sidewalks and going the wrong way on Columbia Street. What's it going to be like for the multi-year process of reconstructing the cantilevered part of the BQE? And what is the way of thinking about that here?
Thanks, James. Let's start with the question on the cross-subsidy model. Jennifer, maybe you can take that.
Yeah, so the project team has taken a really hard look at the capital investment that's required in order to really support a modern, efficient, and all-electric port. And through a combination of our port planning consultants, Moffitt and Nichols, that's done master planning for other parts of the country and the world, as well as really talking with the shipping industry to really understand financing models that are typical, for port infrastructure. The reality is that the magnitude of investment that's necessary here at BMT is significant, and a lot of it is because of deferred maintenance. The Port Authority had not invested, continuously in the pure infrastructure. So Some of the $1.75 billion for port infrastructure is a result of addressing that deferred maintenance. Some of it is also to really invest in a modern pier configuration. What we've heard consistently both from our port consultants and the industry is that the finger piers that exist today are obsolete and no longer meet the shipping requirements for international container vessels and barges to berth at BMT in an efficient and safe way. So we need to invest in a new marginal pier that's very expensive given sort of the size that we have to provide in order to support the wider range of maritime uses that we believe are feasible at BMT with the right investment. So it's about supporting this port not only in continuing to receive international containers, primarily in the delivery of perishable foods, but also to unlock the opportunity for this port to handle more aggregate and construction staging that can reduce trucks off of our local streets, potentially support more container throughput, but also importantly, really become a key anchor for a citywide Blue Highway network. In terms of financing models, so why couldn't we just invest in public funds to really pay for this? Again, it's the sheer size of the cost, $1.75 billion. It is not atypical for other cities around the world to also use housing development and cross-subsidy from housing and other commercial development to help pay for pier infrastructure and for what we call topside infrastructure, the electric cargo handling equipment, in order to support a sustainable all-electric port.
Thanks, Jennifer. There was a second part of that question, which was focused on cars leaving Congress onto Columbia Street and the potential traffic impacts. I'm wondering, Seth, if you can take that.
Yeah. Well, I guess, first of all, this plan's not going to eliminate cars. You're absolutely right that cars are a big part of the problem, especially on Columbia Street, and bypassing the BQE and sort of hitting that choke point at Atlantic. What the proposal does is it creates space for the bus. So it's not saying take all the traffic that's on Columbia and then add a new street and then merge them together at Congress. What it's saying is make it not feasible for cars to bypass on Columbia anymore as they're doing today, and help that bus move. It's true that some of those cars may still choose to bypass on that Van Brunt North, and we're unlikely to fully eliminate the choke point for cars at Atlantic. That's a much larger and more challenging issue. But what we can do is create priority for the bus through it. I was looking at the B61 schedule today at night. It's scheduled to take 14 minutes from IKEA to downtown Brooklyn. At rush hour, it's scheduled at 25 minutes. And we know that doesn't include your wait, and it doesn't include when it gets bunched or delayed. And so it can take dramatically longer. So the challenge to move more people through this neighborhood and the existing folks through this neighborhood from our perspective, or one of the things that this project can help address is making it closer to that 14-minute time than that 30 or 35 or 40-minute time by creating real priority and a dedicated right of way. So that's the vision there, but not trying to, but acknowledging that you're right, that cars are a large part of the issue here. It's not just trucks.
Thank you, Seth. We'll go to Deborah next.
Hi, I represent 220 families that live right now between Columbia and Van Brunt, from Sackett to Summit. And I will tell you right now that we have the experience of living here for 40 years on top of Pier 10. And so we are the residents who live on a pier and have been for a very long time. There's a lot of variables about living on a pier. One of them is noise abatement. And we have asked all of our representatives to represent us in asking you, and I haven't seen it presented yet, a noise abatement program, berms, walls, some ways of being able to protect us against the noise that comes out of a pier, which happens now on a regular basis, often 24 hours a day if a ship is docked. You are now expanding the pier 4 times the size. You're introducing a lot of equipment. But the one equipment you can't stop from working is the sound of a forklift operator backing up. It's a safety issue. It's a sound that penetrates the environment. The present shipping person in charge of the pier has refused to stop the men from working overnight because, as far as they're concerned, the ship has to leave the dock. And so consequently, up to 4 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock, you'll hear the backup sound. You probably have experienced it from a truck backing up on your block. It's piercing. It's very high decibels. So even if you operate electric cranes, even if you bring in a state-of-the-art quieter equipment, you're still going to have forklift operators being able to lift those heavy containers. And now you're expanding from Pier 10 down to Pier 8 with the same operation happening around the clock. I'm sure you're under the same pressure that you can't stop shipping and you have to do it for a certain timetable. That's number one. Number two was there any envisioning of, in lieu of residents of luxury rentals or condos or anything of that sort, or residents of any kind, did you ever consider opening up those buildings with the most beautiful view of New York? Honestly, it probably is the best view of New York anywhere. To manufacturing, academic, research parks, things that do exist all around Brooklyn Navy Yard, the Army Terminal, on Roosevelt Island itself. These are large parks that do attract people, employees, workers, so that the space is not just industrial, but you have academic and research. I do believe that there are many corporations who would love the view that we have when we have access, which is right now only on Pier 6. So I was wondering if this group has ever considered, instead of residences, if you do need the rent from other people to sponsor this pier, did you ever consider other sources than residents?
Thanks, Deborah. So a couple questions in there. One about noise abatement and sort of the sound impacts and strategies related to that. And a second part of that question is wondering if the teams looked at other uses outside of residential, academic, manufacturing, industrial, and research. And so Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so about noise abatement, what we've learned from speaking with other port operators in other cities is that, as you alluded to, there is a potential benefit with electric cargo handling equipment that they might operate with less noise impacts. I wouldn't purport that it's eliminated altogether. I think you raised a really important point where when we are at a stage where hopefully we can put an RFP out for a future port operator, EDC would work closely with that future port operator through the RFP and through, that procurement to make sure that their operations take sort of noise issues into consideration and how they think about operating the kinds of equipment that they use on site, while recognizing, as you have, that there might be constraints about how flexible those operating parameters might be, because we also have to balance the cost of labor in order to make sure that we have an efficient port. But I think there are ways by, really establishing a partnership with a port operator who will have a long-term lease. It'll be in their interest to operate in a responsible and sustainable way that's thoughtful of the existing residents as well. Oh, and then in terms of the question about whether we looked at other uses besides housing, the answer is yes. EDC has a lot of experience, both through our leadership, Andrew Kimball having led a lot of the redevelopment at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and currently in his role at EDC and with a lot of teams here, really, doubling down on providing affordable industrial space at Brooklyn Army Terminal, at the new MADE campus, at Bush Terminal. So on one hand, we're committed to thinking about how to support sort of innovation in the industrial sector, and how by integrating the green economy and climate innovation, we can think about the industrial sector differently in New York City and along the Brooklyn waterfront. I think the reality, though, too, is that although industrial rents are increasing because the amount of supply of industrial space has not grown significantly besides last mile warehouse facilities, the reality is that industrial rents are low they are not sufficient in paying for the cost of new industrial space to be built. So it is a type of space that requires significant public subsidy. So that's one issue, just from a financial feasibility perspective. And then also from a market perspective, the kind of demand that we're seeing for industrial space is really from small firms. These are either industrial startups and or mid-sized firms that are growing that typically require maybe 2,500 to 5,000, 10,000 square feet at most. So it is, I think, difficult to imagine a 122-acre site being dedicated for industrial uses because there's not the demand for that amount of like industrial users to be able to occupy that much land at BMT, nor sort of the financials that can support that amount of new industrial space being built. In terms of academic users, I think there's opportunities in the future for EDC to, identify whether there's in fact academic institutions who are interested, like at Governor's Island and at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, in investing in, some kind of academic R&D use. We were really interested in working with our port planners. They had the experience of doing master planning of supporting a maritime school on the West Coast that actually secured a large container vessel that they use for training purposes. There doesn't seem to be the demand for that kind of facility here at BMT, but I think there's future opportunities for us to continue to explore those kinds of partnerships.
Thank you, Jennifer. We'll go to Gary next.
Yes, my question was just as far as one of the biggest things there is to be able to get in and out of the area rather quickly. So one thing that was mentioned is I know the shuttles to the local F and G, but those don't really go to a lot of prime locations in Manhattan. If you had one central transportation location somewhere in the middle or maybe one at each end and provide nonstop shuttle service to Borough Hall or Court Street or something that has the 4, 5, or 2 or the 3 that can take you right to Lower Manhattan and also to Midtown, I think that would allow people to get in and out much quicker without a bus that stops every block and then takes you to the F or G that doesn't really go to where a lot of people want to go to. And also, my second question, in addition to the nonstop to one of the more popular subway lines, would be expanding the ferry service also to Lower Manhattan with more service and to 34th Street on the east side. I know ferry service is kind of difficult because it's hard to increase service until you have a lot of people, but you're not going to have a lot of people in the ferry service until you have a decent schedule. So it's kind of a catch-22. But certainly those are 2 items need to be considered into the future for the transportation.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, Seth, I think 2 questions in there, one about direct connections to subway lines and then expanded ferry service as well.
Yeah, both are like very similar to discussions that we've been having throughout the process. I'd say I'll take the ferry one first because I had this conversation with the head of NYC Ferry literally last week. We've heard a bunch of times people wanting to get to East 34th Street. It's one of the most popular destinations because it's that Midtown access, and it's absolutely something that's under consideration. And EDC is really clear that we'd want to increase frequency. You're right that there's a chicken and egg problem when we have service scheduled every 50 minutes. People can't rely on it as sort of their main mode. And so with the additional demand from the site and probably before that demand's even online, we'd look to increase the service frequency and identify additional destinations from the site. To your point about F&G, you're right. It's not as well integrated with the rest of the network. I'm a former MTA planner, and one of the first things we were talking with DOT and the MTA about the B61 that they mentioned was, well, we already have the B61 already hits the F&G at Smith and Ninth. So maybe when it gets to downtown Brooklyn, are there opportunities to connect it up to Borough Hall? You're also right that it makes a lot of stops, and so when we talk about so just on the B61, the answer was probably. It would take some real work, mostly on DOT's part, but it's something that I think all parties are excited about introducing, and that's something that could happen independent of this site. But the extra attention on the B61 that the site unlocks, because you're able to create priority, and we know there'd be additional demand, could help catalyze that change to make it beneficial to make the kinds of street changes that would need to happen in downtown Brooklyn to make that happen. But the B61 does make a lot of stops, and we don't have defined routes for the shuttle at this stage. We've heard a lot of different ideas, including direct runs to the IRT to the number lines in downtown Brooklyn, service through the tunnel to Manhattan, or even off to Atlantic with more limited stops. And I think that can make a lot of sense. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Seth. Any other questions from the group? Just want to encourage folks to use the raise hand function. Okay, seeing none, I'm going to go to one that was submitted in the Q&A function. This one is for David Lowen from EDC, so I'm hoping that they're able to join the group here. The question is, why is the proposed marginal pier so far into the water? Is that to have more space for housing? And the reason why these piers are so incredibly expensive?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So the reason the marginal pier goes so far into the water is multiple reasons, but primarily it's to get the pier closer to the channel, which would increase its effectiveness and its ability to be used for a variety of uses for maritime uses. The creating a marginal pier is really what the maritime industry wants, as opposed to finger piers. The finger piers were built in the 1950s, and the industry has changed significantly since then. And having a large marginal pier that goes out close to the channel is really the result of many conversations that we've had, both with our consultants and with maritime operators throughout the industry. So that explains why we've done that. It is in response to conversations we've had about how best to serve the maritime operation community.
Thank you, David. We'll go to Victoria next.
Hey there, it took me a second to unmute. Thanks, Chris. My question really is about the legal mechanism. What legal mechanism is going to be in place to hold the promises that are in this plan to be legally enforceable and accountable for generations to come? This is a huge plan. It's going to take a lot of time to roll out. We know from the Atlantic Yards GPP plan that the community benefits agreement wasn't fulfilled, and they still have built only 2/3 of their affordable housing 20 years later. So what legal mechanism? I know in Gowanus we had these promises of, agreements written into the zoning text. So I'm really interested in how you're going to make them enforceable long-term when you and other, the people here at the table will not be here, part of this process.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, so the question here is what is the mechanism to enforce commitments related to this process into the future? And I'll hand it over to Jennifer.
There are different ways of enforcing them. So, there's a role for the community to play, like the Gowanus rezoning. We're proposing creating an oversight task force for BMT so that there are community members who can play a role in really holding the city, EDC, and developers accountable for delivering on the commitments that we make. Another mechanism is through, the proposal to create a BMT DC, or new nonprofit local development corporation, as an entity with a governing board that would have representation of mayoral appointees, the electeds also appointing representatives as well, where you also have essentially an oversight and governance board that has decision-making authority to ensure that enforceable commitments, where possible, can be integrated into future leases with the port operator and with the developers. So I think it's through a combination of, the BMT DC, an oversight task force, where you have a board and a more community-based sort of oversight body that work together to make sure that the commitments are followed through upon.
Thank you, Jennifer. We'll go to Leah next.
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute there. I have 3 questions that I'll ask really quickly. The first question is, should the project go forward, do you have a clear timeline of how long it will take? And what are your plans for shoring up infrastructure and the congestion that is already so incredibly bad on Columbia Street over the course of what I assume will be nearly a decade to build this? And then secondly, I would really like to know what the EDC wishes they had done differently to avoid the impasse that has resulted between the people who live here and the people who have proposed this project. Do you wish, what lessons have you taken away?
Great, thank you, Lee. And was there a third one? I had 2. You had mentioned 3. I just want to make sure I got them all.
I combined the first 2. What is
Got
a clear timeline for how long this will take, and what will
Yep.
be done to address the congestion during that timeline?
Got it. Okay, great. Yeah, so timeline question on timeline phasing specific to congestion as well, and then asking about lessons learned from this process for EDC. And I'll pass that to Jennifer to get us started on phasing and timeline.
Yeah, so, should the task force vote positively to support this preferred site plan, we would then start the environmental review and GPP process early next year. We are anticipating that GPP process could take about a year. Following GPP and Public Authorities Control Board approval, late 2026, we would then create a BMTDC, this new local development corporation, with a governance board that has mayoral appointees, state appointees, as well as local electeds, appointing members onto that board. That BMTDC would then be responsible post GPP approval in putting RFPs out for a future port operator to offer a long-term lease in exchange for private investment that ideally would eliminate the need for an ongoing operating subsidy for a future port, as well as attract private financing and investment into the pier infrastructure and to the all-electric equipment that would be required to operate a port at BMT. That BMTDC would also put RFPs out for the housing development and mixed-use program to realize those new benefits as a part of the overall plan. Currently, our current sort of timeline for project implementation is 10 years. We also take into consideration sort of the reality of market conditions changing. And so while at the outset, we're planning for a 10-year implementation timeline, that process could take longer depending on market conditions, access to financing, and so on. In terms of how we address existing congestion on Columbia, we've been upfront that the BMT project is not going to solve for congestion on Columbia Street. What we are being responsible about is working closely with DOT to make sure that we're designing the BMT mixed-use plan and circulation improvements in such a way to really align and support the BQE central goals. So what that means, for example, is to the best extent possible, really, designing streets that encourage the use of Bound and Hamilton Avenue for truck traffic and other vehicular traffic on BMT to really use the Hamilton Avenue BQE interchange rather than Atlantic Avenue. And then in the BMT North area, designing uses as well as the greenway alignment in such a way that really supports safer pedestrian crossings and bike access to Atlantic Avenue and Brooklyn Bridge Park. So it's a combination through those street designs and through land use planning that we're trying to reduce the impact of future development at BMT on existing conditions around the BQE and Columbia Street. In terms
Jen,
of, yeah, go ahead,
I'd
Seth.
understood, and maybe she can clarify. One of the questions is about the impact on congestion during construction and during that potential 10 years. And we're really clear that one of the goals for construction and for the site is waterborne delivery of construction materials to keep those off the street. And what I'd say is with a site of this size, the construction is going to be staged. And what that means is a lot of those materials and movement of materials can happen on the site in stages, including the delivery of, say, a Van Brunt North or a Conover extension relatively early in the process. So those vehicles don't need to be on Columbia or the existing Van Brunt and surrounding streets. So there'd be we're not there yet on having a really detailed phasing and construction plan. That will come. But we're certainly cognizant of different ways that we can reduce whatever effects that construction would have on those existing streets. So to make sure we're answering that part.
Great, thank you. We'll go to Victoria next.
Yeah, Jennifer, I just wanted to clarify that you didn't answer my question. You answered it with how the project would be governed moving forward, but I really want clarification on what the legal mechanisms that the task force being asked to vote on a plan based on givebacks that are now being proposed to multiple different organizations in siloed environments where they're negotiating one-on-one with either the EDC or elected officials to get how for this plan. So the promises and commitments that have been made that the task force is going to vote on to move it forward, how are those commitments that got people to vote yes going to be enforced and not by a governance committee? It needs to be, what is the legal ramifications that will be in place? You can write it into zoning text and you guys are going to have to change the zoning for this. So will you put these commitments into the zoning text when you change it from manufacturing to residential? Since you're skipping ULURP.
Well, so there is a GPP process where if the task force votes in support of moving the preferred site plan through GPP, the general project plan that is adopted will override zoning, but there are requirements then for that GPP to be abided by from developers, meaning that when the BMTDC puts RFPs out and ultimately enters into leases for the port operations, for the mixed-use development, the commitments, to the extent that they will be delivered through the developer or the port operator, will be enforced through those leases. But I also want to recognize that not everything is going to be sort of implemented through a lease. And so there might be other instances like, let's say, workforce programming that EDC might be funding more directly that may not have a legal mechanism for enforcement. But that's where a combination of the BMTDC with the Oversight Task Force will work together with the EDC to make sure that those sorts of programmatic commitments are actually implemented and followed through upon. So for me, it's not evading your question. It's just recognizing that there are instances where leases can provide that legal enforceable mechanism of land use changes, of how development actually happens that conforms to the adopted GPP plan. But there are other types of programmatic commitments that might be enforced really through ongoing oversight and partnership with EDC and the BMTDC. And I want to recognize I didn't answer the previous question before, Victoria, that I think Leah asked, which was maybe taking a moment, reflecting on what we might have done differently in the planning process. I think two things, just speaking from my perspective. One is, I think, thinking about how we might present sort of planning systems differently, meaning the sequence. So, we might have wanted to present our resiliency plan, our transportation plan, for example, as sort of key infrastructure that is foundational for supporting, new development at BMT, to present more of that work earlier on in the process for input and feedback from the task force and from the community. before talking about housing and mixed use, so that we really demonstrate, I think, both our understanding and commitment to making sure that that key foundational infrastructure is in place to support, new types of uses on the site. Another thing that we might have done differently is maybe to have done more visioning and planning work and engagement with the community before we started the conversation about financial sustainability. Because I think the team found it very challenging to be able to engage further with the community about the kinds of mixed uses that we wanted to support in order to achieve community benefits through this project, because we had the conversation about how to finance the investments in the infrastructure maybe too early before we had enough of a dialogue with the community about what we wanted to envision for this site and what we wanted to accomplish in order to achieve more community benefits before talking about how to actually pay for it.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to go to a question that was submitted to the Q&A function. This one is for Seth. So the site plan options from the project planning process did not test an extension to the subway. Only bus and shuttle options were considered. The subway extension has been suggested multiple times during community feedback process. It has also been explored through 2 master plans for the site developed prior to EDC's project. Has the EDC seriously studied the addition of a subway extension to the site, or will the EDC study this in the future? Why or why not?
Thank you for the question. That was, I think, the first question that I got about this project. Oh, I don't know, sometime last year was why not a subway, or will there be a subway? And the MTA released a 20-year needs assessment a little while back that looked at a lot of the different capital expansion plans floating around the city, ranked them by sort of a cost benefit analysis, but really took a hard look and costed out what subway options could be to Red Hook. And what they came up with is the most cost-effective scenario would be an extension of the W train, since there's already capacity in the Montague Tunnel where the R comes through, coming down into Red Hook. They priced it at over $11 billion, and this was already a couple years back. And from a kind of cost benefit compared to other expansion projects, rated it basically at the bottom compared to like Interborough Express or Second Avenue Subway or other transit improvements proposed around the city, or North Shore Bus Rapid Transit in Staten Island. And so I chatted with them about, if we're putting 10,000 units on the site, does that change that calculus? And the answer was no. You really are looking at many tens of thousands of units before it starts to like veer into that could make sense from their perspective scenario. However, what they also said, and what I think makes sense, is even if we were building a subway, and this project doesn't preclude that into the future, if project delivery prices go down, if the MTA finds cheaper ways to deliver subways, or there's more money available. Subways take a lot of time, particularly a larger investment like this. And so you'd still want to make those bus and ferry investments as interim improvements that would then live alongside the subway, since kind of the operations of those types of vehicles can scale up and down based on other options. So we're not looking at a subway as part of this master plan. It's frankly just not big enough. And I think maybe in a perfect world, we'd be able to afford one, but that's not the reality of how much those systems cost today. However, what I'd say is bus and ferries can handle this scale of development. They need to be better than they are today to do it, which is part of why we're making those proposals. But there are other dense neighborhoods around the city and the region that are not overly auto dependent, that rely primarily on buses and ferries and walking and biking to get to rail or to get to Manhattan. Examples are like parts of the far Lower East Side, a lot of Bergen County in New Jersey. Most people commute to the city by a bus to the Port Authority bus terminal and then hop on the subway and have kind of similar or slightly longer commute times than Red Hook. We'd like to bring those Red Hook travel times down, but it is possible to move very large numbers of people by Boston Ferry, especially when we're so close to the city and to downtown Brooklyn.
Thanks very much, Seth. Victoria, I see your hand there, but we are going to take a quick pause. I want to check in with any folks on any of the language channels. So any of the folks that are Spanish speakers, the Cantonese or Mandarin speakers, if you have a question, we're going to invite you to raise your hand. We just want to take a moment to make sure we're answering questions from anyone on the non-English channels. Okay, not seeing any. So we'll go to Victoria next.
I think you might need to teach people that are in the chat how to raise their hand, because there are a lot of questions in the chat and in the Q&A. So I'm just getting picked on because they don't know how to do that, I think. But my question really is about the tax structure. Many of these large developments, including Hudson Yards, get huge tax breaks as encouragement to develop. And then on top of that, they also then get their taxes reassessed to get them reduced. What mechanisms are you going to have in place to make sure that with already the subsidies and amazing opportunity that we're trying to make sure we're fundraising here to invest in the port, they're not going to be able to trigger those large, and what are the tax incentives that you're offering? And then are you putting in a mechanism so they cannot try to challenge their reassessments moving forward, so that we're not, the money that we're counting on to invest in the port cannot be reduced?
Thanks, Victoria. So question there on the tax structure. I will hand that over to Jennifer or David.
Got it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, I think there's two different questions there. One is about reassessment, and one is about the taxes in general. So, taxes in general, we should point out that what we're anticipating is both market rate and affordable housing. And affordable housing can be delivered potentially in the form of a 45X type building, which is a mixed income rental building that has some market rate units, some affordable units. It's also possible that some of the affordable units would be delivered in forms of fully affordable units, buildings, and the condo units would be delivered in the form of fully condo buildings. So the units that would be delivered in terms of mixed income rental buildings, we are anticipating that there are existing tax exemptions for that type of building. Those are necessary in order to make those buildings work and to make them self-sustaining and cross-subsidizing. And so we do anticipate that the units, the buildings that are partially affordable, partially market would receive the tax exemptions that are as a rent exemptions that exist in the city. When it comes to the condo buildings, there are no tax exemptions, and in fact, we're counting those buildings to pay full taxes, as you mentioned. We need those buildings to pay full buildings. It's very similar at Brooklyn Ridge Park. The condo buildings did not receive any tax exemptions and pay full freight, whereas the one building at Pier 6 that is a mixed income affordable / market rate rental building does receive those tax exemptions. So when we are putting together our financial model for bridging the gap between the amount of funding we have from current existing grant money, both federal, city, and state, and what we anticipate needing, we are basing that on an assumption that mixed income buildings do not really pay a significant amount of taxes because they would receive a large tax exemptions, but the full condo buildings would pay full freight. In terms of taking away the right to reconsider their taxes, that is a right that all condo owners have in the city, and it's very important for tax purposes that these pilots or payments in lieu of taxes are treated exactly as any other real estate taxes are treated. And so the owners of those condos would have the right to challenge their assessment, just as any other unit in the city has the right to do that. That's what happens at Brooklyn Ridge Park as well. But those challenges go to a board at the DOF who determines whether they are going to be successful. And so far, even with the units in Brooklyn Ridge Park that have that right, the park has been more than been able to raise the money that has been anticipated, and we anticipate that will be the case here as well.
Thank you, David, and apologies that the audio was a little bit choppy there, but we were able to hear you pretty clearly overall. The next question I'm going to take from the chat is, how dependent is the entire BMT project on federal money? Do we know if that money will continue to exist given the Trump GOP House determination to undo the IRA and all sustainability climate projects? If all federal funds vanish, what is the plan for completion of this project? And for that, I would turn it to Jennifer.
So we've secured a $164 million US DOT mega grant. We have, no signs that that is going to be clawed back by the Trump administration. Should we, for some reason, not have the grant funding available from US DOT, I think we would need to look at other ways of being able to, plug the gap to be able to fund the pier infrastructure. So, yeah, that's what you would do.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next, we'll go to John.
Sorry, my internet is a little off, so I hope this goes through. First of all, I don't know. That money's not coming. I mean, that money's not coming, just so you know. But the problem here is, before we even get into the weeds of all this and how many units and this and that or whatever, it's just been the process. And it's disappointing for you to say that, well, maybe you should have framed it different, but like the whole process here has been just horrible. Like, we've been kept out of everything, closed door meetings, the hand-picked people, and it's just from beginning to end, the whole process has just been horrible. And it's been a charade of deep community engagement, and nobody feels it but you guys. You guys are the only ones that pat yourselves on the back and say, wow, we did a great job. The community doesn't feel that. And if you notice, it's the same faces in these things. You're not reaching everybody. Well, most people don't know what's going on, just so you know. And that's been a fact. And we've been saying that, we've been screaming it. We've been asking for a town hall where all the task force members, that can't be so hard. Full task force members, let them see and hear from us directly, and let us hear and see and understand them directly. And that, for some reason, why can't that happen? Shouldn't be too hard to do. I can help you put it together if you want to do it. So, but my question right now goes back to David. Because as I look at the map, the marginal pier goes very far out into the water. And that reason that you gave, I don't know. I think it looks like it goes so far out into the water so that you can have more space for housing. That's what it looks like when you look at the map. Like, if you didn't have to go that far out, then you wouldn't have to spend this much money. So, like, what is the reason? And I don't want to hear MOSFET or whatever, because we don't get access to those reports. Can you send us those reports of their consultation and what they said? Because you haven't made that public, I don't believe, right? So we don't see that either. So what is the actual reasoning why we have to go so far, making this so much more expensive than it really needs to be, in my opinion?
Got it. Thank you, John.
So
I think. Go ahead, David.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I appreciate the question, John. And as I mentioned before, this original pair is an important part of bringing the port up to modern standards. This is a port that is, coming into 80 years old, has not been maintained well, and is not really built to the modern needs of the current shipping industry. Even if we were not building or taking on this project, the piers 9A and B had previously been condemned because they were in such bad condition, and the dive inspections that we received for Pier 8 as well as Pier 7 indicated that they both also needed significant investment in order to keep them open past the next 10 years or so. So all of these piers require significant investment, regardless of whether you're just trying to keep them in their current formation or whether you want to modernize where they're shipped. And since they require such a significant investment, while we were doing that, we might as well bring them up to the modern standards, which is, as I mentioned before, this large marginal pier that goes out close to the water. In addition to being able to meet the needs of the maritime industry by rebuilding these piers, we are also able to raise them up It takes them out of the floodplain. Provides significant resiliency for the bird as well. Right now, the piers are, I think, I believe, issue around 8. By rebuilding them, we can bring them up to over 12. If you look at piers that have been built around the world over the last couple of decades, this large marginal pier does not seem so unusual. And it is exactly what the maritime industry is needing right now. What they need space to move large containers around, space to move goods around, and space for to move trucks around. Thank you. Seem to have lost my
Yes, we
video.
thank you.
Yep.
We're going to go to a question from the chat. What is the max height of the new residential buildings, and how many new residents are expected? And I'll ask Jen to answer that.
There are different building heights depending on the district within the site. But for example, at BMT North, which is next to the Columbia Waterfront District, we've taken task force feedback into consideration in concentrating the taller buildings upland of Pier 7, where it is close to Brooklyn Bridge Park, mass transit, the ferry stop, to propose maximum building heights of about 42 stories tall. It then tapers down to about 30 to a range of 25 to 30 stories tall maximum in BMT North as you move from Pier 7 towards DeGraw Street. So basically the height comes down so that it is sort of more similar to the surrounding buildings along the Columbia Waterfront District. That's a maximum building height. I think importantly, we've also really prioritized keeping the base height at about 65 feet tall, or about 6 stories tall, so that's mirroring the existing scale of buildings in the Columbia Waterfront District. In the Atlantic Basin and BMT South districts, you have building heights that range from about 25 to 30 stories tall. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the scale.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And there was also a second part of that question, which is the number of residents that are expected with the development.
So we're considering different unit sizes for the housing. So if you have about 7,700 units, let's say that you imagine, a 2-person household, just for the sake of math, you're looking at a total new population of, let's say, 14,000 residents or above. But obviously that number can range depending on the unit mix. And one of our commitments as a part of this planning process is to consider a variety of unit sizes, from studios, 1-bedrooms, 2-bedrooms, and more family units. So, depending on that unit mix, the total new population can really range.
Thank you, Jennifer. John, yes, we'll go back to you.
Keep going with the thing. He said they need the space. We agree. We're saying give them all the space. I'm talking about how far they're going into the water, right? So that you can have housing closer to inland. If you didn't go so far into the water, and I don't know how you haven't explained that yet. I mean, we couldn't understand half of what you were saying anyway, because of your internet connection. But if we didn't have to go so far into the water, I'm sure it would be much cheaper. And it just seems like we're paying so that we can go further into the water, so they can have the housing, and possibly even getting the land ready for developers to develop. Because this is a really astronomical, like really piers, it's just a pier and some cranes. You're not building a NASA space station here. So I don't understand why it has to be that much money. And if you can, prove it, then let's prove it.
Thanks, John. I think David, I'm not sure about your audio, but the question there is, again, going out into the water with the pier, reasoning for that.
Yes. I mean, that is how much maritime construction costs. I have 20 years under my belt of building things on the waterfront. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. I have 20 years of maritime construction under my belt. It is very expensive to build things on the waterfront. As I mentioned before, even if we were just trying to maintain these piers, we'd be in the several hundred millions of dollars to do that. And we believe that the investment that we're making here is vastly improving the usability of these piers. I appreciate that with your vast experience in waterfront construction, John, you don't agree with that. But I'm telling you that we've vetted this through multiple sources. We've spoken to multiple consultants, multiple operators. We have a lot of experience at EDC, both as an entity and myself personally with maritime construction. These are typical prices, and this is what it costs in order to create a new modern pier. The current port is outdated and suffers from years of deferred maintenance.
Too is I think, David had mentioned that we had done a lot of industry outreach. And so what we've heard from port operators and from shippers is that they prioritize wharf space over having a lot of sort of deep upland space. And so focusing the new marginal pier and creating a lot of wharf space became really important in order to support more efficient container movement between Pier 10 and the new flex terminal, which is where the new marginal pier would support, is a flex terminal. And specifically, that flex terminal would support the transfer of containers from international vessels towards barges that would be used for the Blue Highway. And so creating sort of a continuous berth and wharf from Pier 10 to the marginal pier supports more efficient cargo handling that then lowers the operating costs for supporting the shipment of containers and other packages by Blue Highway to Hunts Point, Manhattan, and other points within the city. Lowering those container handling costs is really important in order for Blue Highway to become cost competitive and attractive for shippers and customers to choose Blue Highway as the transportation mode rather than trucking.
Thank you, Jennifer. We'll go to Michelle next.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I just want to follow up on something that Jennifer said. So I'm happy to hear that you're thinking about the height and advising that the taller buildings are on Pier 7, where there's like less residential buildings. But when you spoke about decreasing height near DeGraw, did you say up to like 30 floors high to mirror the height of the buildings on the Columbia waterfront? Because I live on the Columbia waterfront and it's made up of buildings that are like 3 to 6 floors high. There's no like high-rise buildings down here. So I don't know where, I don't know if I misheard that or well, like what buildings you're referring to.
Yeah, so let me be more clear, and thanks for asking the clarifying question. So for new buildings that front on the west side of Columbia Street on the BMT site, the base height would be 65 feet tall, meaning about 6 stories tall. And so that's intentional, so that is contextual to the buildings in the Columbia Waterfront District. There would be towers on top of those bases that would be higher. But in the DeGraw section, it would be at the lowest overall building height. I'm not remembering right now what that exact building height would be, but it's about, let's say, 20 stories or so. So the idea is that from DeGraw, you have lower overall building heights, the towers being, let's say, about 20 stories tall, the bases being only 6 stories tall, and then it ramps up in height towards Pier 7, where at Pier 7, you might have towers that are about 42 stories tall. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the range. The other principle that we also wanted to apply towards the urban design of the buildings and their height in BMT North is for the taller buildings to be on the port side of that district, to again try to have relatively lower scale buildings on the Columbia side of the project.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let's go to Victoria Rocco first, since Victoria Alexander, you've asked a few questions. Victoria Rocco, are you there?
Can you hear? Can you hear
Yes.
me now?
Now we can, yes.
Apologies, having trouble with my mute button, apologies. I just wanted to ask some questions around renderings. I think one of the challenges we all face here is the difficulty envisioning what you're mentioning here specifically as it maintains around some of these base heights versus taller tower heights, this to scale specifically, as well as the relative size to the port adjustment, because what's very difficult to understand is these towers will be right up against that port, right? It is not, there will be a street there, but it is still overlooking, not overlooking beautiful water, it is overlooking port operations, right? So this is unusual setup to anything we have existing really anywhere in the city that I can imagine, where you're gonna have luxury towers overlooking port operations. So I think it would be helpful for the community to understand the size of this project at scale, which is not clear from the renderings, right? Because when I see the renderings that you provided, I see 6-story buildings, which does not represent the towers that will go on top and the sliding scale from Pier 7 down to, let's say, the end of BMT North. So I think it would be helpful for more visualization in that. And then my question overall to, I asked some questions regarding the traffic about, you know, this is an unusual site. We don't typically see towers being built without parking at those luxury levels. You mentioned some funding for shuttle buses, and I just wanted to get a sense for the number of residents expected in this area. Has any studies been done around what the number of shuttle buses that might be needed? Because I thought there were some really good points you mentioned about the buses improving and some high-speed ferries, but that is not, and even New Jersey has that, those are not people's daily lives. That's a commute to work. What are people's daily lives living here going to be from a transportation perspective? How many shuttle buses to accommodate that? And do we have sufficient studies that will clearly represent this new neighborhood and the minimal infrastructure currently built at this point?
Thanks. I think a couple questions there. I think one, sort of getting at the relationship between the port and the towers and buildings that may be adjacent to it, and hoping Jennifer can take that and explaining that relationship a bit more. And then Seth, hoping you can take the question on shuttle buses and understanding the demand and need for those. So Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think probably the best response for now is, you know, I think it's a good suggestion for us to think about in our next public workshop to incorporate into our presentation some massing diagrams so that you can get a better sense of the scale and variation of the buildings that are being proposed for BMT North. So you can understand how we've designed them in such a way to be sensitive to both the Columbia Waterfront District as well as the port. And again, sort of the variation in height, bulk, and in building typology, because I think it'll be hard for me to keep describing sort of what that looks like. So we can make sure to incorporate that into the next public workshop presentation. But, you know, part of, I think, what we try to show through the visualization of the new street design of the north-south street is that it can be designed to be relatively wide in both supporting a new neighborhood street, a micromobility lane, a greenway. And so the idea is to create through that new street design and amenities, a buffer between the new residential development and the port.
Great. Thank you, Jen. We'll go to Seth for the second question.
So on shuttles, can you hear me all right? My headphones are, okay, great. Yeah, we've done some back of envelope. It's really going to depend on the route, how much service that gets. So for instance, if you're running relatively frequent service, at least by shuttle bus standards, like an MTA bus, for, say one bus from BMT North and another from South with some local stops to the closest subway at sort of relatively frequent speeds, that would get you like 5 to 10 years of service. That would carry not everyone. So that's part of why I talked about it as potentially a transitional or like catalyzing transit intervention. It might move 5 or 10 or 15 or 20% of the transit demand at full build. But if you're bringing it in as the site is coming online, not everyone is living there or working there yet. Like as we talked about, that's going to take many years. But what it does is start to create desire lines to make sure that there's additional transit options from the outset when maybe only a quarter of the buildings are built. And then at more moderate frequencies, you can get a lot more time out of that degree of investment. Or if you wanted to sort of go for broke and run a more robust and longer service at higher frequencies, say through the Hugh L. Carey Tunnel, it's less. You'd probably only get a few years worth of service because that's a more expensive route to run. So we've started looking at the trade-offs, and I think this was something that the community and the task force really raised for us, and we're trying to think about what are the best ways to meet the overall objectives and the principles stated at the outset of this presentation to help make sure that the new site and the new residents really utilize transit to help lead the MTA into being the ultimate provider of transit that works both for these new residents and the surrounding community. And so the shuttle is a flexible option. This isn't typically how waterfront developments use shuttles, right? Like if you think about other developments not right next to a subway, they often have shuttles that are like rush hour only for existing residents only, not very frequent and frankly not all that helpful. This is a greater investment that could do a lot more than your typical shuttle. But that's how we're thinking about it. But I think we'd welcome feedback. Like I said, there really isn't a determination of exactly what kind of service these would need to provide that would be most beneficial at this stage.
Great. Thank you, Seth. I'm going to do a quick time check. We're at almost at 8:30, and I know we're going to start to lose folks. So we're going to go to Brian and Jeff since they haven't had a chance to ask questions. And if Michelle, if you could drop your question in the chat, and then we'll close after we go to Brian and Jeff. So Brian, go ahead, please.
So thank you. So Seth, I appreciate your acknowledgement that the auto traffic is not going to be reduced. It's going to be increased, right? From this project. I mean, that's what you said before. And I think that logically that's what's going to happen. So I think we've talked ad nauseum about the congestion, but has safety also been brought up as part of that? Because I have 2 young children, they go to PS 29, they cross over Hicks Street. And it's like, it literally is like playing Frogger crossing Hicks Street. And I know other residents have complained about Columbia Street, which is also badly congested. And I personally know people who've gotten hit by cars. So I think that, we're looking at adding, I think 3,800 housing units. Jennifer mentioned this earlier, and we're looking at an average of 2 people, per unit. So we're looking at doubling the amount of people in the neighborhood. With all due respect, I think it's lunacy that we're thinking about adding this many people, considering the challenges that the BQE project is facing us, because it's not going anywhere. Thank you.
I can start on the safety question. Thank you for your question, your comments. I think on the first point about more vehicles, like intensified uses on this site with additional jobs will lead to some amount of vehicles. Our goal with this plan is to reduce that amount as much as possible, pull them off, and mitigate their impacts on local streets, and move them off of the kinds of crossings that you're talking about to the extent we can. But on that slide where we talked about collaboration with DOT, they specifically call out some of those Hicks crossings over the BQE on like Kane and Union and Sackett as being places that really do need interventions for safety and to make it a better pedestrian crossing experience. And so we recognize that's an important goal of this project, to make the pedestrian movements not just on site but around the site and on those desire lines to throughout the neighborhood better. So appreciate your question, and safety is certainly a part of the conversation with DOT and a part of this project.
Thank you, Seth. And then we'll go to Jeff for the last question.
Can you hear me? Yes. With all respect, there's been a lot of discussion tonight about housing and vehicular traffic. BMT is first and foremost a marine terminal, and there hasn't been as much talk about the Blue Highway, which of course doesn't really exist in substantive form yet, but I believe it will, and we're working toward that. We're one of many companies trying to do that. I'd like to know if EDC is taking a reactive or a proactive stance toward Marine Highway. And I'd be interested in knowing if there's going to be any specifics on the type of vessels, such as must they be electric or can they be diesel powered? And finally, I'd like to mention that for all those new residents, regardless of how many there may be, is EDC going to take steps to ensure that they understand that they're going to be living next to a working port? This sounds a lot like the person who buys a house next to an airport and then complains about the routing of jets. So I think it should be very clear to anybody who can afford to buy a luxury condo or apartment on the Brooklyn waterfront that they're going to be part of a social industrial experiment that favors maritime use. I'd like to hear that stated. I think that would give a little reassurance to the fact that this is a marine terminal. It should stay a marine terminal. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, two questions there. One on the city's approach and strategy around the Blue Highways, and then a second on sort of how will potential residents be made aware of the proximity to the port. And I'll hand it over to Jennifer.
Yeah, hi, Jeff. So EDC is all in with supporting the Blue Highway network, which is why we're focusing so much on investing in the right infrastructure at BMT, but also at Hunts Point, which we see as an important shipping point to really establish a service between BMT and Hunts Point for really the delivery of refrigerated containers containing perishable foods from international container vessels that berth at BMT, transferring those reefers onto barges that are then shipped to Hunts Point for last mile delivery into the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center. And we think that there's, possibilities for creating other shipping points as well, really making the most of EDC's control of other waterfront landings in Manhattan, for example. So another key opportunity might be on the west side of Manhattan at Pier 92 as a part of the Manhattan Cruise Terminal planning effort. We're looking at the opportunity of also creating a Blue Highway landing at that location. Although I think one of the more exciting opportunities is relatively more near term at the downtown Skyport, where the plan is by 2027 to have that landing ready, not only for vertical electric helicopters, but also to serve as a Blue Highway landing for smaller package deliveries, or what we call micro freight. As a part of this network, we believe it's also important to continue to work with vessel operators and owners to really look at electrifying tugs as well as barges. And so part of our Blue Highway planning is also about continuing to work with vessel owners and operators to support their efforts in investing in R&D to make it possible and feasible for electric tugs and barges to be deployed in service of the Blue Highway so that we're truly electrifying this transportation mode. And then finally, in terms of like the steps that EDC would take to, I think, sort of market this project as a mixed-use industrial and housing and commercial district, I think that's a very important part of our planning work, in part to support the ambitious transit-oriented and pedestrian-oriented district that we want to plan for. Part of that is about marketing it in a very direct way that we're being upfront, to prospective homeowners as well as renters that you're essentially buying into being a part of this innovative district and living in a place where there's an active working waterfront, but all these other amenities as well to take advantage of. It is very much an experiment, but part of it is about marketing it to people who want to believe in being a part of that innovation.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. So we are over time, so we're going to move towards closing and next steps. I do want to flag for folks who have submitted questions, the project team will be using the questions to update the FAQ on the website. So please check back there for updates if your question wasn't addressed tonight. But I'll turn it over to Jennifer Sun to talk us through next steps and close us out.
Thanks. So we just wanted to highlight opportunities to stay involved in learning about how the preferred site plan continues to progress through our task force and public engagement process. So there will be another opportunity for learning more about the preferred site plan and our commitments to delivering community benefits in early June when we're planning for another public workshop. I believe we'll have a combination of both in-person workshops as well as virtual so that people can participate in different ways. As I've highlighted, the agenda will include updates on the preferred site plan. We're continuing to integrate task force and advisory group feedback into the land use planning and how we're thinking about resiliency and transportation infrastructure. We'll also provide an update on our commitments for programmatic and planning goals that would be achieved through investments in infrastructure. And then we'll also highlight our latest thinking around how this project would move through environmental review, should there be a positive task force vote. And then our latest thinking also about governance and project implementation. So with that, I'll hand it back to Chris to close us out.
Great. Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate your time. Please, as Jennifer said, please, we hope you can join their future workshops in early June. So thank you all and have a good evening.